Welcome, and thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Last year, many people were treated to a wonderful odyssey in theaters when they went to go see James Cameron's Avatar. Although he spent more than 20 years trying to conceive the idea of how he could take this story from his imagination onto the screen, our guest joining us today has been studying Vedic philosophy and looking into the Avatar for more than 40 years to be able to share with us what this ancient wisdom has for us and how it applies to today's world, especially at a time when we could probably use something so valuable. On our program today is the founder of the Vedic Academy of Sciences and Arts. He has also shared his knowledge of ancient Indian wisdom to audiences around the globe. And what I'd like to do is welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today, author of the book Spiritual Teachings of the Avatar, our guest, Mr. Jeffrey Armstrong. Jeffrey, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you, Daniel, and namaste. Thanks for that lovely welcome.
Now, let's talk about that first, that word, namaste.
Which they used in the film so beautifully as I see you. Mm-hmm. But they just took off one part. In Sanskrit, it means I see you as an eternal divine being who's here on a journey.
Now, let's talk about this book. And 40 years you've been spending time to learn and understand this. Tell us the value of this.
Well, you know, like a tree, to use the metaphor used in the film, without our roots, then it's very difficult for the tree to actually perform what it's supposed to do, to grow and to grow its fruit and flowers and grow in the branches. So for me, the ancient world is actually the root of our existence, which in the flurry of modern technology we've tended to forget. But it's filled with the seeds of our own personal greatness because these cultures, these ancient cultures, really solve problems that we're facing right today.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting when you talk about the root of ancient cultures and how they can help us solve the problems of today. As I remember a really interesting book that I read years ago. It was The Tao of Physics, Fritjof Capra.
Yes.
And he was talking about in the beginning of his book that here we are on the brink of these wonderful discoveries in quantum physics, but yet when you go back to these ancient lineages like Buddhism, Hinduism, and I'm kind of at a loss what the other one was, that they or Taoism that is, that they all understood a lot of these concepts thousands of years ago. So what is it today that with our technology, it makes us feel that we're further ahead than as we would look back to these so-called barbaric cultures when it comes to technological perception?
Well, the main misunderstanding is that we've made progress by burning energy that can only be burned for about 100 years, and that's solid progress. Mm-hmm. Whereas, in fact, unless we violate the main laws of physics, the laws of entropy, which there's no evidence we can do, we're going to have to return to renewable energies or move to a different method of living on the planet. So the ancients said the same thing. They said, if you're not careful and you take too much energy out of the planet, you'll start to mess it up. And that rule or that law was how they governed their lives, most indigenous peoples. We're so much in violation of that, we think we've progressed, but it may not end up to be progress. It may be 8 billion people with only enough energy to take care of 4, and that would be pretty bad.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did you first become involved in the Vedic cultures? Was there a specific inspiration where you said, you know, I feel like I've about become awakened, so to speak?
You know, to tell you the honest truth, I was one of 2 people in my school who had the highest IQ. One was getting straight A's, and I was getting straight D's. That tells you a lot right there.
Sure.
Because I wasn't satisfied. I didn't really feel I was being told the truth. And I found that when I asked certain questions, people not only didn't have answers, they didn't appreciate the questions, whether it was ministers, priests, rabbis, school teachers, elders. And the world was clearly a mess. We were hiding under our desks to protect us from the threat of falling nuclear bombs during the bomb alerts, and that wasn't going to work. So it just seemed like I lived in a world that needed answers, and so I started looking everywhere. And that led me to the East. It led me to India. It led me everywhere, but it led me there in a deep way.
Now, I think what's really fascinating about Avatar and its scope is the fact that this is an opportunity for, I guess, a soul, as you say in your book, what happens is the soul is actually of the life, and then we just kind of use the human body for the experience, so to speak. But this is a valuable way of actually viewing and experiencing life from, say, a different perception. Talk about what the avatar actually is.
Yeah, and I actually call this experience reincarnation, which is the endless process of getting in your car and going to work each day and coming back home. No, it's actually the larger process of us as the individual, as the consciousness, going from body to gather experience in this world. Cameron did a very good job of showing this as he showed Jake Sully going back and forth between his two bodies. And he used that as the computer term avatar has come to mean, which is if I have a proxy, if I have a body in a computer game, the computer world says that's my avatar. But that's not the original meaning of the word avatar. But it's interestingly connected to the fact that we're all here trying to figure out why we're all here and what to do. So the question of what to do and why we're here is the one that science doesn't want to address, in fact. And interestingly enough, since you mentioned science and physics, as you should, modern genetics ran into a big problem. They found out how much information we have in our genes. So the average one-celled organism has 300 encyclopedias of information that it's running its one-celled body with. So that's how much is in its library. In our library is about 1 million to 2 million encyclopedias of information that runs our body. So when Crick, one of the people who discovered the DNA molecule, found that, he looked at that and he said, well, there's no possible way 1 million volumes of information arose in 4.6 billion years, the amount of time that science says our planet has existed. And this is the same methods of the ancients of India and these older cultures. They said, look, this didn't just arise. This is a purposeful experiment that was created by a grand intelligence. And so that's the question that science is running away from because they were abused by medieval Catholic Church. And so we have this quandary that religion looks like it's abusive on one hand, and science doesn't want to talk about morality, philosophy, and higher truth on the other. The East didn't have difficulty with either of those conversations. They said it's all the same conversation. So that's the background behind Avatar. James Cameron could only say so much of it, so I decided to put more of it in my book.
Now, I find that interesting because at the one hand, we want to progress and I guess do the right thing, which you see a lot of elements of that actually occurring today. But then, as you're saying here, on the other hand, we seem to be running away from it or blocking it. Why do you think we do that?
Well, there's probably two reasons. One is just general ignorance, which we all have to plead guilty to and should be working on to try to know more and know more of what's known. And the second is greed and maliciousness. Mahatma Gandhi said it pretty nically. He said, the Lord has provided enough for everyone's need, but not for their greed. So we do live in a Wall Street #2 greedy world, or we've gone beyond greed, greed Mach 2. And it's because we have the amplification of technology plus the basic human impulse to do that. And now we have a global planet that's a single spaceship, but we're not behaving that way. And unless we can learn how to behave more cooperatively and really take care of each other, these human faults will get amplified to be pretty problematic. So the concept of Avatar is actually the descent of the divine to Earth to remind us that every being here is valuable and divine, among other things.
Now, in your book, it's interesting, just about a week ago, we did a wonderful little segment about the Bushmen of the Kalahari, and this is considered to be the oldest living humans on Earth and considered to have the oldest religion, if you will. And going back to Africa, I remember when I was first exposed to voodoo, which was through anthropologist Wade Davis, is they talk about possession, and then this is a way that they can actually call to their ancients to come to them, and they become possessed. Apparently that's how zombies were created in the zombie movies of the 40s or something like that. But, I find that fascinating because, here's an indigenous culture, and I've seen actually examples of this in different cultures around the world through my reading, is that they do the same thing. So it's sort of like that's how they maintain the wisdom for their actions of today. And in your book, that sounds very similar.
Yeah, well, the basic premise of all of these ancient societies is that we're surrounded by more invisible reality than the visible reality we see, which again is the conclusion of modern science now that they've looked closely. That there's more invisible reality surrounding us. Good example is our body has trillions of cells, but there are now proven to be 9 times that many microorganisms that live with us as symbiotes in our everyday life, but we never see them. So we have 9 times the number of bodily cells we have as living symbiotes that are intertwined with our own lives, some trying to eat us, some trying to help us, and we don't see them. So the ancients said, right, that's the way the world is. It's managed by divine intelligences that you can see their movements, but you can't see them per se, but you can see what they're doing. You can see it's purposeful, you can see it's for your benefit or detriment, and you can also get in touch with them. And some of them are malignant, and some of them are sacred, and some of them are beautiful, and some of them are poetic, but they're divines, and they surround us. And the universe is more complicated than we think. If you go to India, you'll see some of the temples have these row after row after row ascending up the temple of beings that are on the roof of the temple. And what they're trying to say is that the universe is populated by intelligent beings. And personally, I think that people, in a sense, became superstitious and afraid of the invisible, and it was capitalized upon in various ways. But in India, this whole understanding that, there's all kinds of entities out there, but voodoo would be a lower level of, you might say, communication with that pyramid. But at the very high end of that pyramid would be the divine beings that are running the whole universe. And beyond that would be whatever the supreme reality is. And so, in a sense, this brings us to yoga, because yoga is learning how to be in contact with the source of your existence, to go inside and connect with the invisible source of your existence.
I know sometimes for people something like that may seem a stretch, and you mentioned in your book about how our IQ's culture has a very limited way of perceiving the world. Describe what that is and how it blocks and how we might be able to get beyond that.
Well, we all have experience of walking in two worlds because we go to sleep each night. And
right.
If your dream life is vivid enough, it seems as real as your experience during the day. Isn't that? It seems unreal. In fact, people try to live their dreams. So often we have amazing dreams that instruct us and inspire us, show us what's possible, take us maybe beyond the limitation of our everyday lives. So the problem with IQ reality is that it can just be about the surface of everything, perhaps even about its limitation. And it's a linear processor, slower, not as fast kind of experience. And we know this in the difference between men and women. Women have more intuitive intelligence, more EQ, I called it WeQ intelligence, which means direct perception. So think of it as intuitive perception. And this is more typically the shamanic perception of most of the indigenous cultures. They've learned to directly intuit what nature is saying, and often to be right. So that faculty gets lost if you live in the city too long, because you don't need to use it. And we saw that in the film, where Jake had a lot of IQ experience, but his EQ, his WeQ in the forest was not very good.
Isn't that true?
Yeah. People who ride horses, on the other hand, which is why they use that. I rode and trained horses all my life, so you have to use your WeQ and your intuitive intelligence to ride a horse. You can't talk to them with vocabulary, but you do talk to them with your emotions, with your body, with your language, with how you posture, with subtle signals. So that's WeQ, and then I named a third one, which is what the yogis call third IQ. And third IQ is the understanding that we are more than our body or our mind, that we're actually the consciousness that's in both the body and the mind. And that consciousness is the part of us that doesn't die. Our consciousness is actually, according to the ancients, eternal. It doesn't die.
What I think is fascinating, too, as you read through spiritual teachings of the avatars, you brought up just earlier about dreaming. I myself have been an active lucid dreamer since 5 or 6 years old. And I started really, as I was reading through the book, going, this is quite amazing when you consider that concept of the dream world, that we go to sleep at night and we're in a separate reality. And in many cases, for people who are lucid, that's intentional dreaming. You're really in this world and you're experiencing it almost as if you're in this reality here. And I thought of the possibilities of how, I guess, creating an avatar or actually having an avatar, if you will, could really kind of perceive and change the way that you are in this world to be more socially as well as environmentally responsible.
Yes, and what you said about lucid dreaming is very valuable, and of course to all psychologists, Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, anthropopsychologist, even eventually someone like Carl Sagan. You can see that his film Contact segued into that quite interestingly. There's a great YouTube of Carl Sagan standing in a Shiva temple in India, and of course he's the consummate scientist and astronomer, but he's standing there and he says, only ancient India and modern science calculated the age of the universe in billions of years. And as it turns out, India calculated the age of the universe accurately to trillions of years. So we have a tendency in the West, often just by prejudice, to think that ancient people were IQ not as intelligent, but actually they were both. And they, what you could think what meditation really is practicing lucid dreaming, like you said. I did the same thing, starting at quite a young age, in my early teens. Read a book of Freud's dream analysis and started practicing lucid dreaming. And what it led to, and I'm sure it was the same for you, and it's the general experience, is that if you do that diligently, you can actually begin to be active in your dream world in the way that you're active in the physical world. So extend that, and yoga said, well, not only that, but you can explore through your consciousness things that you can't get in a rocket ship and go look at. But your consciousness can actually go there. So the concept of avatar, both for us, the full potential that's in us that we haven't tapped, and that we could be visited by divine intelligences who could embody apparently as humans, but actually behave extraordinarily beyond what human capacity is. That's the history that India and other parts of the world have experienced. They've experienced extraordinary beings coming to Earth and looking like humans, but having 1,000,000 times or 1,000 times beyond the human capability.
You know, it's funny, Jeffrey, I was just thinking of a wonderful little film that I used to love as a kid, or I still do actually, and it's just one of those that are way off the beaten path called Fantastic Planet. And
yeah, I remember it.
Yeah, and it was really, I loved it as a kid because it was just weird. It was on another planet, there were strange creatures, but interestingly enough, it's about a race of people that, I guess, if you will, are planetoids, whatever you want to call them, and they were blue. And then, of course, there were these small little people known as gnomes who were actually looked like humans. And, of course, there's a big revolt because basically these large blue people were enslaving these little humans. But there was one scene that was really interesting where they go into a meditative state, these large blue people. They kind of go into a bubble and they go across the land, and they go to this land where it looks like there are these large human bodies where they settle down, and then they get to enjoy touching and feeling each other. And, you know, in Avatar, when you take a look at that, it was just really quite fascinating to think, okay, if it's possible in our dream worlds, as we were just discussing, and lucid dreaming to actually go to other worlds, which I know the yogis, I've actually read about dreaming quite extensively, and they talk about how they're able to project out into the universe, to just, you think and therefore you're there.
Yes.
That if that's possible, which I'm sure it is, I just haven't gone that far yet, that what if it was actually happening from somewhere else to here? And you actually described that those are those kinds of things that actually do occur because the avatars are necessary, those beings are necessary to come to basically steward the earth in a responsible way. Kind of go into more detail about that if you could.
Well, Daniel, if you think about life in general, and this is something modern science has really scrupulously avoided, but they're really into cause and effect. They say cause and effect is running everything. Fair enough. Cause and effect is running everything. In which case, our actions would also continue. And if they're saying, we don't want to talk about moral cause and effect, well, we can all see that religion has made that a difficult conversation sometimes by being violent and that's necessarily the best thing to do. But beyond that is the question of whether or not life is meaningful and purposeful. And if you decide that life is not meaningful and not purposeful, you end up in all kinds of dark and despairing places. And read all the philosophers, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Fear and Trembling, The Sickness Unto Death. As soon as they encounter that thought, they do see the consequence. A chaotic, amoral, disintegrating, vicious, dog-eat-dog world. So the opposite viewpoint would say, no matter how big it may seem, the universe is actually a great cosmic university of experience where countless trillions of beings are existing at different levels of experience, and they're here learning. And it's all a divine academy for learning.
Mm-hmm.
So with that view, then the idea that at the speed of thought, or as modern people think, and probably reasonably so, there are vehicles that could travel through space. The Vedas, actually one of the great epics of India, the Ramayana, begins with a scene where the antagonist is flying in an airplane he just stole from one of the divine beings who conducts the universe. He's racing across the earth in an airplane. And that epic story that it's written in the Ramayana, which is one of the chapters of the Avatar book, is maybe hundreds of thousands of years old, maybe 1 million years old, according to the authors in India.
Mm-hmm.
And conveys information to us that the universe contains many, many different kinds of beings, and that we can cross it through consciousness. They can come visit us. They can embody, and they're actually recording for us these visits. So it does require us to think a little bigger.
Now, one of the things that I feel has really been lost, at least in a technologically advanced culture, say such as the United States, is rites of passage. And I've explored this with different guests throughout the years. Talk about the value of a rite of passage. You talk about this in your book, and you could see in the movie that same thing was happening. For him to really understand in the movie Avatar the people, he thought he could just be in the body and maybe kind of trick them. But the reality is he had no feel or flow or understanding of their world and how they are in it. That's a rite of passage that she was taking him on. And I think that that's one of those valuable things, really, when it comes to growing children into, responsible adults. We just don't have that anymore, or at least it's very rare if you do. It's been passed off to going to high school, getting your driver's license, becoming 21 so you can drink, graduating from college, your first sexual experience. But yet people seem to just feel like no matter how much they accumulate, they just feel something is missing. And I think it's because of the rite of passage and its lack of that we might be experiencing that.
Yes, and that's very well said, Daniel. And I think that James Cameron did a great service by almost through watching the film, we were reinitiated into the indigenous culture that he created. Mm-hmm. I loved the scene where the scientist, Grace Augustine, probably a great oblique reference to St. Augustine of the Catholic tradition, who created original sin. So Grace Augustine eventually is taken through the rite of passage of seeing the Divine Mother. Mm-hmm. And if you remember what she says, just in her transition, I see her, Jake, and she's real. Mm. So the original way of looking at all of us was we're, first of all, in a male and female body. So there must be a divine reason why we're in a male and female body, and so each group, the men and the women, should be given knowledge about why they're in that particular body, what it means, what its secrets are, how sacred it is, how beautiful it is, how to use it properly. And then they're eventually going to encounter each other, so that should be guided by the adults instead of happening, I used to say, in the back seat of a car. I'm sad to say it's probably happening at way too young an age now to even talk about that. People are now experimenting with sexuality in such a non-sacred and possibly injurious way. And so all of these different ways that we should be told when we're an adult, when we're empowered, what are our rights, What can we do? What is the process of life? What does it mean to be an elder? All of these things. And you'll notice, as sad to say in our culture, now when you're past 50, you immediately know that in the job market you're useless. And 10 years later, because no one wants to pay your medical, and 10 years later you're headed for the scrap heap called the old folks home, the home for the elderly, where the wisdom of 60 years or 70 years or 80 years is now deadheaded off into a place where they're just kept away from everyone, and young people run the television instead of the elderly who have something to say.
Right.
So all of these things that we're losing them because we don't see life as a process. We don't see this continuity from stage to stage to stage that educates us and informs us and gives life its structure. So we've literally let technology rip the structure out of life altogether, and it's a free-for-all, which isn't very gracious, and it's not having a good result, I don't think. I think a lot of people are seeing it.
Well, as it was told to me one time by a guest, it's that's our old growth forest. This is where we can learn the culmination of our experiences and what we can do about it, and that's why I brought up the rites of passage, because it's like we've forgotten and we need to start remembering again. And I just wonder if the anxiety and the frustration and the destruction is a result of that rite of passage. I remember many years ago, my daughter, she was very little, and a spider's running across the sidewalk, and she immediately kill it. And I'm thinking, where did she get that idea from? I said, what do you mean, kill it? Hold on a minute. Let's take a look at what this is doing. And I started saying, this is a divine being that's on its way somewhere, probably looking for something to eat, just like you would be running to the refrigerator. How would you feel if somebody stomped you out just as you were opening up the refrigerator door? I don't know if she's ever killed any spiders after that, but she stopped, and I said, just pay attention. This thing might actually entertain you beyond what you can ever imagine. And I think I was actually paid that respect years later as I was sitting in my living room, and all of a sudden a spider comes across the floor, and I said, don't do it. And it stopped. It was almost as though it knew exactly what I was saying. And then like a puppy or a shy dog, it started trying to inch forward, like, okay. And I said, what did I tell you? I said, don't. And it sat there for a minute, turned around, and then just went the other direction. And I just laughed, and it was just the funniest thing. But that we actually can connect like that, as you mentioned earlier about, people who ride horses. You don't just talk to them, but there's an instinct in its own language that goes on. And I think that if we could permeate that, I can see where, as your book talks about, it's a great way of actually learning the things that we can learn in such magnificent ways, where school is kind of incidental, it seems.
And Daniel, one of the, would say the upsides of modern science is that now many well-meaning people are beginning to study some of these things. The most recent related to this is that brain research is now finding that modern brains are smaller than primitive brains, so-called, of the past, which means they're shrinking. They're shrinking because they're atrophying, and they're atrophying because we're not using our various faculties that we would use in a more complete and full situation where we were using our left brain, our right brain, our IQ, our WEQ, our third IQ, where we were surviving by various kinds of skills and activities. So we're actually in danger of messing up a very delicate mechanism that evolved and was strengthened by certain actions. And we may think we're progressing, but we may indeed be atrophying, regressing, growing certain parts of the brain through our cell phones and our computers, shrinking other things, and we're certainly shrinking our capacity to interact with one another. Look at how lonely people are in cities. This is the other thing you saw in the film. The indigenous cultures touch each other. They're connected. They talk. They communicate. They have meals together. We have cities with millions of people, and everyone is alone, and they don't know even how to, the basic human skills of connecting with each other. And these are all the skills that the ancient and indigenous cultures had to a very high degree mastered and integrated and knew. So this brings us to the other very important point about Avatar, which is that the Avatar's appearance on the planet is to say that the purpose we're here for is the evolution of the persons, the beings, the living entities here, and not the material things. This is our misdefinition, that building skyscrapers and building buildings and perfecting matter is why we're here. But the Avatar says we're here to perfect each other. The asset here is all the beings. That includes the animals, the creatures. They all should have a dignified, interesting life. Even if they're going to end up on your table as food, don't keep them locked up in a cage somewhere in a dungeon, because you become the Dark Lord you become Darth Vader, locking beautiful animals up in a wicked factory somewhere, punishing them their whole life, and then having them for dinner. How evil is that?
And then wondering on top of that why, especially in technologically advanced societies, why there's such a large rate of cancer.
And depression. Yes, cancer and depression. Well, you just ate a depressed being who had no life and lived in a dark hole. So at least all the indigenous cultures, which again they showed very graciously in the film, it didn't just say you have to be vegetarian. It's a nice life if you can. But if you live near the North Pole, you're probably going to eat animals. But more to the point, they should have a dignified life. You should honor them. You should have a dignified life. And the dignity of life is deeply, deeply under threat. And I really applauded Cameron for his film, because it really was raising the flag for that dignity and saying, hey, these indigenous cultures were brilliant. Look how they thought these things through. Mm-hmm. So India is probably the headquarters for this thinking.
Mm-hmm. You know, I find, and I must be honest too with the listeners out there, Jeffrey, is that when the movie came out, I did enjoy it. I thought visually it was a unique spectacle, but then at times I felt like, well, I think it was a bit shallow in some areas, and it was just me. And I think part of it also is that I got caught up in what some of the critics were saying is this is reminiscent, of Walt Disney's Pocahontas, for instance. But the more, especially as I was reading Spiritual Teachings of the Avatar and really just trying to meditate on the whole thing, it's like, really there isn't enough of that kind of information out there, okay? Now, putting it into perspective with the Xboxes and the PlayStations, everybody wants to be an avatar. Everybody wants to be a character, where, and this is what I think is interesting about video games, with no responsibility. You get killed, you get back up, and you do it all over again. Now imagine putting yourself into a perception of an avatar where you're actually somewhere else. You don't get that second chance once you're dead. And, you kind of wonder how the spiritual teachings of the Avatar, according to your book, what people can do to begin to apply or begin to see, if you will, what their responsibility is and how that is shared with everything else.
Daniel, the point you're raising is perhaps at the crux of an evolutionary process I was alluding to. Mm-hmm. And I think Campbell is too. When I walked out of the film with my wife, the first time I saw it, I said, well, I think Mr. Cameron has opened Pandora's box office.
I like that.
Because the question here is very profound. This fantasy world that the game players want to live in, is that because someone has taken over the planet completely and there is no freedom there at all?
Right.
And that it's completely dominated by greed, and that you can't go out and meet anyone, and there's no social communion? So are we raising a generation of people whose only meaningful experiences can happen with a machine that allows them to fantasize a reality instead of have a real one? Mm-hmm. Is this the last retreat of human consciousness into a metal box, away from the exhilarating experience of being here on the planet because somebody else owns everything, has taken it over and made it into a theme park? Mm-hmm. And this takes to one more question. I'll tell you an interesting thing. When Obama was elected president, like many people, of course, the idealism that, wow, a black man has gotten into the Oval Office. So the first thing we're thinking is, hope he doesn't get shot. And the second thing I'm thinking is, the first group of people he should bring into the White House are the indigenous peoples of North America. He should have been on stage there with all the leaders of the tribes of the indigenous peoples of North America saying, yeah, these are my people. And he should have been saying, now we're going to plant trees all across North America on the roofs of buildings, everywhere. We're going to green the whole country. And the fact that not a move has been made that I know of in that direction signals to me the real great issue that Cameron pointed out. Home tree is in danger. The whole thing. And if we really are an energy problem right now, why aren't we replanting the country? Why aren't we replanting our cities? Why don't we have work crews out there retrofitting the buildings with devices that are energy efficient? So I believe that what Cameron did in a very interesting way was raise the ancient ecological flag that says this planet is always supposed to be kept as a garden because you can't eat manufactured items. You can only eat the things you produce from the earth.
I find one of the most alarming things, I guess, if you will, on what you're talking about is the consciousness that continues to perpetuate the kind of destruction that we experience. And I don't mean just environmentally, but we're also talking about psychologically and spiritually as well. You look at the Bush administrations, you look at the Reagan administrations, you go back before, I thought Jimmy Carter was actually sort of on track in the right way. You go back to Nixon, and you go back before that, Kennedy was an inspiration, but before that, there was all these perpetuations of that consciousness that said, we need to get as much as we can, destroy those who get in the way of what we want, whether it's natural resources or it's a labor pool. I mean, you take a look at now the thing that's beginning to arise with what are known as the economic hitmen that are coming out of the closet saying, you know, our job is to go into these countries rich in resources and just basically float them loans they could never pay so we can exploit all of their resources while leaving them broke without spirituality whatsoever. And you wonder, what is the consciousness that can continue to perpetuate that kind of behavior? And it's been sustainable for a while, but it seems like the real skeleton is coming out of the closet. What has been your take on that?
You know, I saw an interview with James Cameron where he was explaining that the film Avatar did 25% less well in the United States than it did in the rest of the world.
Oh, wow.
And he said, we had actually somewhat expected that. And then he said, I believe the reason is that they intuitively understood the film was about them.
Interesting.
Because the idea...
They were all white people.
They were indeed. And really, this is probably the thing that George Bush perfected was the ugly American. He will probably be known throughout history from now on as the American president who revealed the ugliest side of our culture rather than the noble side that we would hope would act heroically in the world.
What the true American really is, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, because I'm from America too, so I can say this. Originally, now live in Canada by circumstance. But the idealism that we know could be embodied in America, unfortunately, has never really fully existed. It's just been a possibility that could be brought out if we can quit bullying the rest of the world. And if we can actually embody the principles of protection and individual freedom for everyone, rather than be so obviously running at another culture like Afghanistan just to get the minerals, or somewhere just to get the oil, like Iraq. And anyone who doesn't think that's why we're there is simply not paying attention and not reading and studying. So the real question I think we're all facing at this moment in history is, can enough sincere people hold a more cooperative and noble paradigm, the one that we'd like to think the United States could represent and be the embodiment of? Could we embody that and change the way we do business all around the world? I took Cameron's film as a kind of ironic raising the flag, because it was an indigenous film made by the most high-tech technology that has ever made a film. So it was its own paradox. It was Pandora's box office. It was asking, can we use technology to raise awareness about how to go back to being more indigenous?
That's a great way of putting that, actually.
Yeah. I mean, anyone who's been in technology with an idealism, I worked in Silicon Valley for 18 years, and all of us who were there who were idealistic, not making missile guidance systems, but the Internet and other things, were thinking, if we all communicated with each other, perhaps we could find a way to live with each other.
Now, do you see, because I do know that you talk around the world, and you definitely, I'm sure, field some pretty fascinating questions, especially about your book, and I'm sure that, the James Cameron film actually comes back up a lot, but do you see, from your experience, that maybe grandfather elder has come back, grandmother elder has come back? See, there's another one that we haven't touched on, is how organized religion like Catholicism and Christianity and even in Buddhism has actually literally cast the female down to somewhere just above the animals, and I found that's unusual. Here, a woman gives birth, actually creates and co-creates, and yet they're just above the animals. That absolutely has to change. But as you're around the world, do you sense that there is an emergence that this way of doing things that has been so destructive will actually have a turnaround?
Yeah, I'm very hopeful, and that hopefulness comes from many very real things. And one is, you'll notice that there are probably now about 100 million people practicing yoga around the world, and India hasn't spent 100,000 rupees on sending people out in the world to learn yoga. Mm-hmm. It happened with a few elderly men and women who simply went out from India and started talking about it. What clearly was the case was that it filled a need, and that need is twofold. Because one, 85% of those people doing yoga are female. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. Look in India, do you see 85% of female yogis out in the woods throughout India or in its history? No. You see, the yoga practitioners predominantly were male, though all the spiritual practices in India are really called yoga. So in the wider sense, females were always the leaders spiritually. But in this case, I believe they're actually the Earth's immune system waking up. Ah. Because what the essence of yoga is balance, interiority, a healthy lifestyle, and embodying in a way that is cooperative and respectful to all living entities. Your so-called religious meditation is never coercive in yoga and never coercive in India. So therefore, the idea that we have to be coercive about our final religious viewpoint is the thing that's to be given up. And the emphasis should be upon how we live upon the planet so that everyone can live upon the planet. Mm-hmm. How our products that we use, eat, live with in our body could be healthy. So I see a revival of the feminine both spiritually and practically that I really believe is Mother Earth's immune system being activated and sending reinforcements. So I'm very enthusiastic about the possibility, if we can keep an open internet and keep talking to each other, that we can actually develop new technologies like India. The Tata Corporation in India just came out with a compressed air car that, again, is not getting as much airplay as it should, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So these new developments, I think we're going to see cultures like India and the extensive developments out of the yoga culture affecting corporate life. Women in corporate life are going to make corporations more cooperative. It's already happening with daycare and yoga rooms and better food in the vending machines, mm-hmm. In the cafeterias. So I think the real revolution that is at the basis of all of this is how we live on the planet and how we see each other as, and that's why I love the Namaste, I see you, because seeing each other in a divine way is the secret to not wanting to harm each other. Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing, too, is that, as I was mentioning earlier in the program, the Kalahari Bushmen. So you actually read this book to find God, and they would laugh. You can't find God in a book.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Now, Jeffrey, if you could you give out a website where people can find out more about the spiritual teachings of the Avatar?
Yes, Daniel, there are two. My personal website is jeffreyarmstrong.com. Mm-hmm. And then we have one just for the book, which is spiritualteachingsoftheavatar.com. That's the title of the book. So spiritualteachingsoftheavatar.com. And it's by Atria Beyond Words, which is an imprint of Simon & Schuster, so their websites also have information about the books.
And we'll also have that posted on our website as well. One of the things that we really try to do on our program over the last 7 years is to bring out the stories, as you said earlier, about the car in India. You know, that's not getting much airplay. Chances are we'll probably find a way to go after something like that. But is to show that people are actually taking steps, that this world does change to the world that you dream of, that you are not totally helpless, you know, that you can do something. But ultimately it does start with each individual, you know, and which direction they'll go. So kind of create that avatar, if you will.
Absolutely, and the avatars came and left tools behind that do empower us to stand as individuals in a beautiful and divine way. Mm-hmm. And so that strength comes from imbibing those tools and having them inside of us as tools of thought and tools of emotion that allow us to stand for beauty and truth and love in a world that hasn't agreed yet, but they'll come along if we hold the right thoughts and ideas. So, namaste, I see you as divinely connected to everything, united with and linked to all, and your balance and integrity teach by example the eternal truths you embody. You are now the same in essence as the effulgent divines whose sacred forms you adore in deep and mystic meditations.
The book is Spiritual Teachings of the Avatar. Our guest, Jeffrey Armstrong. Jeffrey, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
It was really a pleasure, Daniel, and I must say that the experience of Over 50 radio is everything and more that I thought it would be. When elders have the airwaves, I think the grace of the feminine divine and masculine divine and a hopeful future is what I'm hearing. So it's a pleasure to be with you.
Very much so. Thank you very much, Jeffrey.
Thank you, and namaste.
We want to thank you, the listeners, for tuning in. Again, visit the website, Spiritual Teachings of the Avatar, or jeffreyarmstrong.com and find out more about this. Also, be sure to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. We'll have this archived so you're able to listen to it, download it, and pass it on to others as well. We can certainly use cooperativeness in that direction. We thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.